if we look at the first Australians who actually came to Australia, often focus of this gentleman here called Joseph Davies, who was the brother of another lady called Margaret Davies, who was his sister. He was a remarkable guy, only in his 30s when he died, sadly, in Korea. But already he had spent time in China as a missionary. He'd set up a school, which is still existing. I think it's Caulfield Grammar in Melbourne. He was a remarkable guy who, even in his short time here in Korea, left a huge impression, and his legacy is amazing. But we learn a lot about the history, the social history of what Korea was like all those years ago by understanding Australia's role in Korea. Let me explain by reading this thing here. It says, the history of Busanjin Ilshin Women's School begins with the adventures of early Australian missionaries. The first Australian missionary, Joseph Henry Davies, arrived in Busan on October 2, 1889. But unfortunately he died on April 5th, 1890, shortly after his arrival due to pneumonia and smallpox. After his death, 5 official Australian missionaries came to Korea and established educational institutions in the Busan, Masan and Jinju areas. Most notably, they founded a shelter for female orphans, which was the beginning of the Busanjin Ilshin Women's School, the first modern educational institution for women. It was an important contribution to the missionaries to introduce modern education for women in Busan, one of the most conservative regions in Korea. So here we see 3 important facts about Korean society, which are not readily apparent. But if we deconstruct the short life of Joseph Davies here in Korea, we can see 3 things. One is the prevalence of pandemic disease across Korea across the 19th century. In fact, even before then. Secondly, the lack of internal infrastructure and transport across Korea. And thirdly, a general comment about organisation of society and the role of women. So firstly, disease. It wasn't uncommon on a year-on, year-out basis for a pandemic to sweep across Korea, sometimes taking a toll of 20 or 30% of the population. It's just so much so that in places like Gangneung, which has a festival today still going called Danoje, they still have a thing called a gut, which is a very ancient form of shamanistic ritual where they actually say goodbye to the unwelcome visitor. The unwelcome visitor in that case being something like smallpox or pneumonia. So they didn't understand diseases, and they didn't understand why these things were catching up. And so the first Australian Korea fell victim to what was so commonplace among many people's lives and health in Korea. Secondly, transport. When Joseph Davies, after they arrived in Busan and then went to Seoul to learn the language and learn more about the culture, they moved down to come to Busan, where they were assigned by the American missionaries. They actually walked from Seoul to Busan. I always thought that story was curious, but it works out that there was no internal transport. Why would there be? Because all the towns were scattered around and they were quite they were quite parochial. They didn't have a need of connection other than people who carried water or other supplies from town to town. And so if someone was to move from point A to point B, they literally had to walk because basically the infrastructure we take for granted today didn't exist. And thirdly, the role of women, the structure of society. Now I say this with a great deal of respect for Korea today, because all developed countries have come from somewhere. We've all had our struggles in terms of equality and fairness, and we're all going through different ways of that now. So I'm not saying this by any means to pitch Korea in some spectrum of of worth. Basically, it's a basic observation to say how much Korea has actually changed. I mean, what a great story of success that in this last 120 plus years, they've moved from a society where there was incredibly constrained arrangement or order in society to a very modern and forward-looking society. It's a great story, and I think we gain a lot by understanding more about ourselves and the country which we wish to have a stronger relationship with, that is Korea, through the stories of the past. That's why we need to know the past, because we're interested in the future.